So what if Luffy can make portals like Emu through the drums of liberation and summon his allies to his aid? Let's get into it. This is a long one. So I got a comment recently from YouTube user RayNEday93. I hope I pronounced that correctly. But what they were talking about was the mark of the abyss and how that reminded them of the X that the Straw Hats used back in Alabasta to discern themselves as the real Straw Hats since Mr. 2 was afoot. With that being said, I was reminded of a video I made during the time that Egghead was still coming out in the manga. This is very appropriate now because as of this recording in the anime, we're getting to the magic circle portion of Egghead in the anime. So with that being said, back in the day, I was under the impression that Saturn was the source of these magic circles, seeing as how the circles are rings and Saturn's name is Saturn after the planet Saturn known for its rings. So I was under the impression that he was the source. However, based on the events of Egghead, that is not the case. But then further on in Elbaf, we do get to see that other members of the upper echelon of Mary Joie can use the magic circles as well, namely the Holy Knights, Shamrock, and Gunko. But what's so interesting about this, and I haven't seen anyone bring this up, there is a difference in the magic circle usage of the Elders versus the Holy Knights. The Elders circle is monogrammed with these fives around it, whereas the regular magic circle that the Holy Knights use just has a pentagram in the middle of the star. So I don't know if there's a difference there. Also, another ability that's most likely granted to the Elders that the Holy Knights don't seem to have is that they can telepathically communicate with one another. And we see that during Egghead. Various Elders speak to each other telepathically without the use of any Mushi or anything like that. This is an ability that the Holy Knights don't seem to have so far. So that in itself is interesting. But given that this ability comes from Emo, so namely the ability to produce a magic circle, the ability to summon anybody with a mark of the abyss through magic circle, and then in the Elder's case, the ability to communicate telepathically, I think all of those things are powers of Emu. Then those abilities are most likely granted to people when they make a covenant of some sort with Emu. And I talk about this a little bit in the video I did specifically on Emu, but getting into that, I also made another video stating how in the world of mythical Zoans, there is a hierarchy. And I'm going to now complicate that a little bit more because I think there is a distinct difference amongst divine mythical Zoans. So to break things down, I think there are 3 types of mythical Zoan fruit out there. Now, I understand that could be superfluous, but based on what we have seen from Zoan fruits so far, even starting from the very beginning with Dalton, Zoan fruits unfortunately are based in being superfluous, as we now know that Dalton has the Ox fruit model Bison, and from what we see going forward in the narrative, there are multiple Ox fruits, just with different models that turn you into different animals that are all related to the ox, namely Kaku. But speaking of Kaku, let's talk about our first type of mythical Zoan, those being those Zoans who are just mythological figures or evil spirits, meaning users like Cerberus, Marco, Stronger, Topman Warcry, Marcus Mars, Nosjiro, or Saturn. All of those guys are just mythological creatures from mythology, but they don't have any divinity attached to them. This is very interesting too when you compare them to regular Zoans like Kaku or Lushi, because when they awaken, they have a black Haguramo. This is first seen in Egghead when we see all the elders appear. But I do think Jupiter is not a mythical Zoan, but it really doesn't matter because mythical Zoans and normal Zoans who don't have divinity have black Haguramos. But I will say it's interesting that it is repeated when we get to Elbaf, when we see Shamrock Sword Cerberus, and it too has a black Haguramo. So the point to take away from this is that if it has a black Haguramo, it's not divine in any means of the imagination. It can be a normal animal, or it can be a mythological creature with special abilities, but it's not a divine creature. This changes, however, when we talk about Killingham, Yamato, and Luffy, because they, unlike the others, have white Hagoramos, or lightly colored Hagoramos. Killingham has the dragon fruit model Kirin. Kirins are considered divine creatures in mythology. And then we have Yamato with the dog fruit Akuchi no Makami, which stated by Kaido is a divine beast because it is the guardian deity of Wano. However, in saying that, therein lies the difference between Yamato and Luffy, because while the Akuchi no Makami is a guardian deity of Wano only, as far as we know, NIKA, which is the ability of Luffy in having the human fruit model NIKA, is a deity worshipped in secret the world over. And we find this out in Elbaf thanks to Saul. So with that being said, NIKA has a wider umbrella of worship than the Akuchi no Makami, because we have a deity worshipped the world over versus a local guardian deity. With that being said, I think that is the third type of mythical Zoan. Those Zoans who are so divine that their influence is spread far and wide, whereas the other divine Zoans are those who are just beasts with some sort of claim to divinity. And of course, under them are the monsters and the mythological creatures. But given what we see in Egghead and what we see in Elbaf and what we see Emu presumably give out to these various people, I am of the opinion that Emu has a fruit that has equal divinity with NIKA, which is why they're able to give out these powers and these allowances to all these various people with a mark of the abyss. With that being said, what if Luffy has a very similar ability to Emu? With that being said, I have to ask you, are you familiar with the term X marks the spot? X marks the spot is a pirate term which allows others to know where the treasure lies on a map, meaning go here and where the X is where the treasure lies. With that being said, the X has had a very interesting history in One Piece, especially regarding Luffy and Vivi, because during the start of Alabasta, all the Straw Hats at that time put X's on their arms to separate themselves from the various clone visages of Mr. Two so they could identify who their actual friends were. With that being said, this too was a sign of unity to Vivi from the Straw Hats as they were leaving Alabasta, to show that no matter how far they are separated, they will always be united and Vivi shall always be a comrade. This then is brought back up in the start of Elbaf in chapter 1130, in which various Straw Hats who joined way after the events of Alabasta were reading the paper in which they saw Luffy in his NIKA form with an X on his arm. I think this is a message from Vivi to the various Straw Hats that she met during that time. However, we'll have to see what the reaction is later, because nobody reading the paper now has met Vivi or knows what the purpose of the X is. Robin has some inclination because she probably saw all of them raise their arms up as they were leaving Alabasta, but she doesn't know the depths of what the X actually means. With that being said, what if Luffy uses the cross or the X in the future to be his magic circle? And the reason why I say that is because I don't think it was a mistake to have the X be brought up again in Elbaf at the same time in which we're getting more information about how the Mark of the Abyss actually works. I think that is done on purpose. Furthermore, I don't think it was by mistake that Luffy, after the time skip, has a X-shaped scar on his chest, which furthermore is where the drums of liberation are said to lie. X marks the spot, quite literally in this case, because the power of NIKA is said to be held within Luffy's heart, as his heart acts as a drum beat, which activates his awakening, as those are the drums of liberation. So, based on the events of Egghead, we also know that the drums of liberation have the ability to activate Emmett, the giant robot in Egghead, for whatever reason. With that being said, too, I think they could have the power to create portals much like Emu. However, I think the pact necessary in order to be able to use the portal in Luffy's case would just be being a friend of Luffy in the past. So anybody he has met and become friends with along his journey has access to the portal, which would mean that they could use the portal and be summoned to his side. However, do I think he could give this ability out? Yes, I think at some point in the future, everybody who is at least in the main cabinet of the Straw Hats will have access to this ability through him. So in turn, they too can become like NIKA and use the X marks the spot portal upon NIKA's behalf, because I think that will just be an extension of what we see in Alabasta with all the Straw Hats having X's on their arms. If you are a part of the collective, you can use the ability. But I don't know if this would extend past the crew itself. Maybe it'll go into the Grand Fleet, I'm not sure. But I do think at least the main crew will be able to use his ability to summon allies to their aid. Perhaps in the final war, perhaps in an arc coming up soon, perhaps even now, possibly in Elbaf. Perhaps Luffy uses his power on accident as a trial run and summons Vivi or Yamato to Elbaf. That's a possibility. But with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede. What's it?